Okay, greetings all to today's webinar about building an international sales network. We've got Zach Zelch and Ernie Watts, two very experienced private sector salespeople and business developers to offer their insights and experience and on this topic. So let's go from here. Ernie, why don't we play off your presentation? Why don't you go through it, and then we'll just get into some discussion topics as we go.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bill, and appreciate the opportunity here.
Ernie, give us also, as you start, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into it.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So again, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for the opportunity, and certainly Bill for moderating, and Zach, who is going to let's say co-host and add some color, I hope, to the presentation and the content as we go through it. There are a lot of things that we're going to kind of cover at a very high level, but I think we'll sort of deviate off into some specific topics that will be of interest to people, particularly if they are just either starting out or perhaps are looking to improve the performance of their international sales network. So just by way of introduction, I have spent over 30 years now really working primarily in international markets. I have worked in a variety of industries, from both industrial sales to consumer products. I'm currently working here in Chicago as president of Trinity Resource Consulting, and we pretty much work with companies that are looking to build or expand their international business. And then Zach, I'll let him say a couple of words just to introduce himself. He's my co-presenter here and the CEO of Global Sales Mentor. Zach, say hello.
Hi. So yeah, thanks for having me. This is always a pleasure to talk to a group in Chicago. And yeah, I was basically a VP or director of international sales for about 35 years. I sold in about 135 countries around the world. And last year I started working for myself for a company. And what I do is I coach and train international sales managers to help them build and improve their processes. And it isn't necessarily just for people starting out. If you think about it, Tiger Woods has a coach, as does Glenn Close, and a lot of very serious athletes and actors work with coaches, and coaching can get you better performance. And that's basically what I do. So I'm going to shut up now, and Ernie can get on with the presentation.
All right, thanks a lot, Zach. And again, I'll be asking you for some comment and color on various topics as we go through the presentation here. So what I'm going to do today is I want to talk about some specific steps that I think companies or executives or practitioners can use that will help them sort of narrow down and focus on how to build their international, particularly their sales performance overseas. So I'm going to be sharing with you, in the interest of full disclosure, some tools that we use at Trinity Resource Consulting. They are not meant to be in any way endorsement of the process, but I think more than anything else, it'll just kind of guide us in the conversation. I know that most people that have been involved with international have been and have some experience to a variety of these topics, whether it's trying to identify prospective markets to go into, how to find partners in those markets, what's the right go-to-market strategy. So there's no necessarily canned approach to this. Many markets are very, very different in their approach. Many industries, many products are at different stages of the life cycle. So again, I'm going to kind of go through a process here that has been fairly repeatable and fairly successful for multiple companies in multiple industries. So we'll talk a little bit during the course of this about, first of all, the partner relationship. What does that mean? There are a variety of definitions here. I would just start off by pointing out that partners, any international market that you go into, you are most likely going to be working with a partner. That may be a distributor or a joint venture partner, but even if you decide to enter a market directly and set up shop, you are going to be working with local partners, your employees, your local tax, your local accounting, other professionals that are going to probably be key to helping you succeed. So understanding partners and how to work with partners is really, really a critical step. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
Can I throw something in there, Ernie? So
Anytime, please feel free.
yeah, so I'm going to say this. I talk to people a lot who are not convinced that channel sales is the way for them to go internationally. And I would say that if you're under about a $500 million company, you shouldn't be thinking about direct selling unless you're dealing with some very, very specific outliers that might make sense. Or if you're doing all of your selling through Amazon or something like that. But for the most part, if you're a $100 million company selling widgets, you should be selling through channels. And let me explain one thing. If you think about it and you say, okay, I have a salesperson who's going to sell internationally, and you can get him on a plane 140 days out of the year, and he's going out and he's doing 140 meetings a year. Now, if that same guy is managing 10 distributors, and each one of those 10 distributors is giving you a salesperson, right? The easy math is you're now going from 140 meetings a year to 1,400 meetings a year, right? For approximately the same amount of money. And that's a huge difference. Now, your guy might sell better, but he doesn't sell 10 times better than those distributors would. So that's what you got to be thinking. Now, those numbers are a little bit off, but they're very much in the correct direction, right? You can increase the bandwidth of your sales organization 10-fold or 20-fold easily if you work correctly with distributors. Sorry, Ernie, back to you.
No, it's a great comment, Zach, and thank you very much. And I would agree with you. Most people, there are a lot of markets and a lot of countries in the world, right? It's unlikely that any organizations go in and set up direct operations in multiple countries on day one, especially depending on the size of the organization. You did point out one very key disclaimer there, and certainly the internet and sales on Amazon or online is a key factor. I'm working currently with a client that is expanding internationally. They are doing it online exclusively. However, they are working with partners, right? There are partners in each of those markets that have expertise working with Amazon. There are distribution partners that help them get their product to market. So it's very rare that a company is completely vertically integrated when it comes to expanding internationally. Even those that are so-called direct are still working with a lot of local partners. So very valid point. We'll talk a little bit also about international performance and market knowledge requirements, right? What does it take to decide which markets to get into? I'll share with you some tools or perspective on things that you can do to help you assess particular markets. And another key point here is some self-assessment. Again, international for a lot of people, particularly that are just starting out, starting to expand, it tends to be sort of stars in the eyes. It's very exciting. Isn't this great? I'm getting into Mexico, or I've got business in Europe. And they tend to rush headlong into it without a very good critical self-evaluation of whether or not they can be effective. So we'll talk a little bit about that and tools that you can use to do some self-assessment and gauge your preparedness to expand internationally. We'll talk about how you can select and prioritize key markets before we just run off on a shotgun scattered approach and try to pick markets that may or may not be the right fit. And again, we'll talk about a more, let's say, structured approach to finding and identifying partners in a particular market. And then, of course, once we're in market, the work doesn't end. We have to continue to manage the partner relationships. If we're working with channel partners or distributors, we need to make sure they're on a good plan. And those relationships change over time as industries and products mature. And we want to make sure that we're constantly adjusting and assessing the relationship as we go. So that's going to be the kind of flow of the discussion that I'll walk through. And again, whether it's Zach or anybody else that has a comment or would like to chime in, please do so. All right, so let's talk about some what would seem to be generic, but can be really critical distinctions in terms of the types of partner relationships that you might encounter or engage with when you decide to expand internationally. There are, at a very high level, what I would consider to be arm's length types of partnerships. And then on the other hand, there are, I think, sort of what I would call more committed relationships. So let's talk first of all about the arm's length relationships. What do these look like? Well, again, this is generally a relationship where a company decides that they're going to expand into a particular world market for the first time often, or maybe it's a tertiary market that they haven't really done business in before. And they're looking to gain some incremental business at basically minimal cost, minimal risk, right? So they may identify an agent or a particular distributor, or there may be a contact with some key account relationships that they're interested in. And this could be somebody that they've met sort of informally at a trade show. It may be somebody who just kind of came in through the website that has expressed an interest in the product. And as the definition would suggest, it's a very what I would call casual type of relationship, right? So some of the characteristics are maybe your market knowledge is limited of a particular country. There's some training that might be provided. You might provide some support materials, which you might then hand to them and ask them to adapt locally. It's not going to be a very serious relationship. It could lead to a few incremental orders. You're probably not going to spend a lot of time working with the partner. And, some business can be generated. It tends to be very low cost and sometimes very low risk. Could be very risky, depending on what they do with your product and with your trademark, right? Which can be kind of critical. But again, this is not necessarily a bad approach if you are looking to do business in a very remote location and it's purely incremental. I'm sorry, Zach, we had a comment?
Yeah, so I'm going to say, I'm not going to argue on this, but I always recommend to people not to do this.
Right.
And my feeling is, depending on what you're selling, you always have the possibility that 10 years from now, somebody is going to say, oh yeah, we had your system in our facility and it didn't work. And you have no idea what they're talking about because you didn't even know that, this was sold. And I've seen this before where people sell to a place, somebody approaches them at a trade show and wants to be their distributor in Venezuela. And now you're committed to 3 years service on a system in Venezuela or someplace like that. So, when you do this type of thing, you're passing over your strategy to some random person, right? Whereas if you start off and you say, these are the markets we want to sell in, we've identified the right markets, we're only going to sell into the right markets with the right partner, you have more control. Now that requires a little bit of discipline. You might be walking away from a little bit of sales. In the long term, I always feel it's better because you won't get surprised. And those surprises can be very costly in the future.
Well, that's okay. So fair point. And I would say 100% agreement. And in fact, the disadvantages of this relationship are probably far greater than the advantages, right? And you've touched on a couple of them. So again, you're not really necessarily sure who long-term you're doing business with. You can run into issues with your trademark. You can run into issues where you think you have an arm's length relationship that you can easily get out of, only to find that you now have, from a legal point of view, a more committed relationship than you thought when it's time to make a change. Typically, they don't produce the kind of returns that people are looking for. So I would agree. It's not necessarily something that you won't do in a particular market, but it should be something done with some caution, with some foresight. As much as possible, it's a good idea to have a clear plan and a clear understanding, even with an arm's length partner in a particular market, for all the reasons, Zach, that you just talked about, right? And for all the other risks that you could come across. The flip side of that, of course, is a more committed relationship. And, clearly there are many great advantages to taking the time to properly assess a market and then properly figure out who's the right partner for you. And obviously, commitment generally means both of you are committed to the success of the relationship, assuming, and we'll talk a little bit about this, that both of you are bringing to the equation all of the tools and all of the commitment necessary to make it work. So having said that, I would just make a comment here that unfortunately, a lot of companies get into or go down this path of a committed relationship, and yet they don't really prepare, do the due diligence. It's almost like we're going to treat it sort of as an arm's length type of relationship, but we'll go ahead and sign a 3-year commitment and we'll put together kind of a basic strategic plan, but they haven't really done their homework to figure out if this is the right partner or if it's even the right market. So they think they're getting into a committed relationship. Both partners might be very committed to making it work, but the business may not ultimately yield the kind of success or return they're looking for because they haven't done some of the upfront legwork to make sure that this is going to be a successful relationship, right? So there are a lot of things here that need to be talked about and considered, and we'll kind of get into some of these. So I just wanted at a very high level initially to talk about partners, to talk about sort of arm's length versus committed, and get people sort of level set on different approaches to different markets. All right. Great. So at this point, let's talk about some of the characteristics of a successful international company and what we like to call sort of a market knowledge inventory. So I made a comment just a short while ago about companies taking the time to do some critical self-assessment before they decide to get involved with international business or even get into a particular market. Maybe they've been successful, for example, in Mexico or in Europe, and now they're thinking they want to start doing business in Southeast Asia or in Japan or in China, for example, and think they can just leverage the success they've had in one market into another. So here, I think we often work with clients that come to us asking about expanding into a particular region. And one of the first things that we like to do, because everybody's so excited about the opportunity, is get them to think a little bit about internally, have they taken the time to really evaluate some of their own strengths and weaknesses, right? So again, I don't show this to you in the sense that these are 20 points that you always have to go through and ask. This is really meant to be representative of the kind of critical sort of self-evaluation that we find companies, when they take the time to do this and to do this with their team, right? Not just with the one executive that's going to be in charge of international, but it's a good idea to get buy-in and support from everybody in the organization. And you need to be very, very self-critical about, hey, are we going to be competitive in this particular marketplace? Do we have features, benefits, prices, supply chain, any issues that we can think of that are going to give us some competitive advantages, right? Not just this looks like a great opportunity. Are we going to be able to get new products to the market? Are we going to effectively be able to leverage our strategies and our operational planning to this new market? What's surprising is when we run these surveys with companies, and we tend to try to get a variety of input from a variety of disciplines, it's always a very eye-opening exercise for the organization because they generally aren't doing as well as they think they are, or they aren't as prepared as they think they are. Doesn't necessarily mean that this is a deal breaker and they can't get on with expanding internationally. If anything, what it does is give them an opportunity to identify weaknesses that they may have, things that may not translate into a new market, and help them get prepared ahead of time before they run off and sign a long-term deal with somebody that they're going to regret, or basically get into a market and find out 18 months later that they've made some serious mistakes. So again, the point here, and Zach, I'll let you chime in on here, is just going through and really assessing whether or not you think you're ready to step in and do this business in a particular country.
Now, I'll tell you what I'll say is also, let's say that you sell a specific thing, you sell into the construction business, and your distribution partners are going to be selling to contractors or something like that. You're dealing with something pretty specific. Virtually everybody who should be one of your distributors in the world knows each other to some extent or another. They travel in the same circles, they communicate, they go to the same shows, etc. So this is really important. If you screw somebody over, you are dead going internationally in the future, both you as an individual and you as a company. Okay, so if you basically say, you know what, we're going to dip our toes in the water, we're going to try these 3 markets out, and 8 months later, a year later, something like that, you say, oh, you know, if this was just too much work, we're gonna pull out, and you leave some distributors in a bad situation, right? Because they've put money into promoting your product, or they've taken orders that now they can't fulfill or anything like that. Don't turn around a year later and say, okay, now we're doing better, we're ready to do this, right? You're done, and you got to keep that in mind, right? So you don't necessarily want to play around with this. If you want to do it right. Prepare yourself and really jump in and do it right, because you can't afford to screw this up and then think you're going to fix it later.
So Zach, before you mute yourself completely, I think if you look at some of the items on here in terms of spending adequate time in the field, results, capabilities, and development of key managers, I know that you can point to real examples where companies decide, hey, Zach has been a great domestic sales manager on the East Coast. I'm going to go ahead and give him responsibility for all of Latin America. And that's their strategy and their internal self-assessment. Let's go. Tell us why that is probably not a good idea at all.
Oh, well, so first of all, I mean, what we also find is a lot of American companies, they sell directly domestically, and then they're doing channel sales internationally. So they don't quite understand very often the channel sales part. But also, you could be, let's say you've done a little bit of business in Mexico. Well, the business culture in Peru and the business culture in Brazil are different from the business culture in Mexico. So suddenly you're doing things that are a little bit different, and you're stretching that out. Now there might be shipping issues, right? One thing that I say a lot, and I've seen this, is when I work with a company, one of the things I'm going to say to them in the beginning is, well, you got to make sure before you get your first purchase order, you want to make sure that you understand payments, right? You want to make sure that somebody in your company really understands LCs. You want to make sure somebody knows how to do documentation. You want somebody in your company who understands shipments, or you want to make sure you have a relationship with the right suppliers who can do this stuff for you. And I can tell you time and time again, people say, Zach, you don't understand. We've been shipping for 30 years. We understand this. I'm like, yes, you've been shipping for 30 years to Cleveland. Now you want to be shipping to Colombia. It's a totally different thing. And I've seen, so one of the companies I was involved with, a while back doing some work for, there was a person in the Ministry of Health of Indonesia who was very interested in a large order. It would have been one of the first of the company's international orders. It was a very important order. And this woman in the Ministry of Health was retiring, and she had this plan. She was like, she wanted to implement this product in the months before she retired, because she thought it would be a good legacy to leave once she retired, to be able to say that this country had shifted over to using this product. The manufacturer screwed up the shipping, so that the shipping was delayed by about 3 months. And the woman said, you know what, this is going to arrive after I've already retired. It's going to make my replacement look good. I don't want this, and canceled the order, and pretty much made it impossible for anybody else to buy it from that company, from that country, which meant that this order, which would have really looked good for the company, never came through, and it took them a long time to get an order this big again, right? So something like shipping can really screw you over. And if this company had done what to be honest, I don't want to sound like a prima donna here, but if the company had listened to me when I said, talk to a forwarder beforehand, make sure you have a forwarder who can do the shipping correctly, make sure you understand the shipping documentation. If they had done that at the very beginning of this process of trying to grow their international sales, things would have gone a lot more smoothly for them.
Okay, well, thanks, Zach. I mean, that's a great real world example there of, again, these are not meant to be a all-encompassing list. They are really meant to stimulate some internal discussion around the what ifs and some real critical assessment of our ability to, for example, number 12, understand early warning signals and adapt to change in trends, right? Sometimes companies are very poor at this or don't want to have to deal with it when things shift or they're not prepared for the volatility of a particular international market. And even that last one, your senior management support for international operations, right? It is really critical. They're very focused on the domestic market and they're saying, yeah, go ahead and expand into Europe. That sounds great. Report back to me in 6 months, but they're not really truly committed to it and don't understand the resources that are going to take and what the returns are. That can also cause some problems. So the point here being is take some time to do some self-assessment before you just start launching and trying to build out an international presence in a particular market. The other piece of this, of course, is now what do we do? If we're relatively confident and we've identified maybe some strengths that we have and even some weaknesses that we need to work on, we need to start figuring out what markets to go into. But before I would suggest you even start doing that, it's really good understanding to kind of understand what are some of the key variables that are important to your business, and can we lay those variables on top of a particular market and sort of understand what the opportunity may or may not be. So again, I'm showing here some examples. Don't get too bogged down in the charts and the X's and the bar charts and what have you. The point here is really to sort of, again, as part of the self-assessment process, to understand, look, what are the macro and micro variables in any particular market that are going to determine how successful we're going to be? Macro variables can include a lot of things that we're pretty familiar with, right? Stability, long-term political stability of the market. Is the market growing? Do they have a good consumer base or customer base for our type of product? And we can determine what those variables are that are key for our business, the macro variables, and we can objectively then, with some research and some attention to the market, start to understand, hey, is this market unfavorable, acceptable, or favorable? Does it have the basics at a macro level that would suggest that we can be successful? But of course, the other piece of that is the micro level, right? So one has to also take time to understand. In this particular case, this is a project that was worked on with Anderson Windows. So they were able to lay on top of, this is their list of variables, internal things to their business that they thought were critical to be a success in any market. They know that they were successful using with these variables in, say, the US and Canada or in Europe. Now we're trying to look at Asia or Latin America. Well, let's run through some of these lists of things, right? Do we have the types of again, homes, the types of construction, the types of industry specific and micro variables that will suggest that this could be a particularly good market? Zach, got a comment here?
Yeah, and I'm gonna throw on that. So one thing that I've noticed also in some industries, healthcare, food, transportation, communications, sometimes legal issues will create what I call a macro compelling event, where you basically say a law has been enacted that requires seatbelts, right? So now you need seatbelts. So if I'm a seatbelt manufacturer, I'm going to look for countries that have recently had a law that requires seatbelts, for instance. If I'm looking at, well, what are the demographics? Who buys my product? Childbearing aged women are typically buying my product. So I'm going to look for countries where that demographic is very common and that's growing. Those type of things are also things that I'm going to be looking for. Ernie, I'm guessing you're going to talk about where you can find this material, or should I jump into that? Or is that?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, there are any number of sources, right? Obviously, you can contract outside help to get this stuff done, or you can leverage maybe even relationships you have or customer relationships. What are you thinking?
Well, yeah. So I was also going to say, So first of all, I'm gonna say this on my website, Global Sales Mentor. If you look under the tools, I have market briefing documents right now available for 118 markets, and they average about 12 pages each on a market. So that gives you a fair amount of material. But to be very frank, I pulled that stuff together. I typically go to the CIA fact book. I go to the World Bank. There's information on pretty much every market in those two places. And then I typically am looking for specific things for different clients. So for instance, there are places to find things on like building starts if you're in construction, or what countries consume the most cement, or those type of things. And likewise, finding information about internet usage and so on. So, there are different websites that give you pretty good information about how the markets break down, with indicators that might correlate with what you sell.
Right. Well, I think here again, I don't want people to get too bogged down in some of these specifics, because not everybody is in the business of selling replacement windows like Anderson. This is really meant to illustrate, I think, again, to the previous discussion and now here, it's important to take the time to not only know your strengths and weaknesses, but to understand as much as possible in a particular market, really some key points. For example, is there an available market for your product? Do you understand the customer needs and how they vary by market? Do you understand which products will most likely be accepted in the market? Do you have an understanding of quality requirements, pricing? Zach, you mentioned different cultures and approaches to business, from Mexico to Peru to Brazil. Right. You need to build a really good base here of understanding of yourself and of the particular markets that you're interested in expanding into.
Yeah, I'll give another example. I don't know if you're familiar with the story about Starbucks in Israel, but Israel is one of the 2 or 3 countries that Starbucks tried to sell into and pulled out of. And what happened was the CEO of Starbucks apparently went to Israel, tried some coffee at a hotel, and he was like, well, they can't, there's no good coffee here. Starbucks will go great here, and opened and moved to open up. But what he didn't think about was Israeli coffee culture really was not used to drinking coffee in paper cups on the move. Right, Israelis don't drink coffee while standing up. They sit down and they do it in a very social way. So Starbucks did awfully there because it was a poor understanding of how people consume that product. So sort of looking for that type of thing and getting good information on the ground can be critical. Certainly Starbucks spent a lot of money trying to get in, which they could have avoided if they had done a little bit better research.
Well, I tell you what, just a sidebar, I thinking about the Starbucks example, I to your point, I remember picking up a business visitor from Spain here in the US, and we spent a couple of days traveling, visiting some of their clients here, and he was amazed at, again, he used Starbucks as the example. Number one, he was amazed that nobody's going in and sitting down and having a coffee. They go in, most of them, they pick it up, they leave. I mean, you always see a few people that are kind of hanging around, but he just thought that was very, very different, right? In Spain, you go for a coffee, It's 10 or 15 minutes where you sit and have the coffee. And then, of course, his other comment was, in Spain, we don't drink liters of coffee. He was amazed at the size of the coffee cups that people were walking out, rushing to their car and taking off in. So to your point, really, really critical to kind of understand the market, the consumer behavior. Is there an available market for you? And I think I don't want to make this too cumbersome, but the discipline here, the discipline of going through and evaluating and getting good input from and support from an entire team internally. And then also, as you look at markets, not getting too caught up in the soft sort of, boy, I'd love to be in China because everybody's in China, but taking the time to try to quantify as much as possible, not just the size of the market and the potential, but some of those other variables that we talked about, and then rate them so that you and your team have a consensus that, while Brazil looks like the best market on the surface of it, we'd be better off expanding initially into Colombia, Chile, and Mexico because of the economics, the duties, the difficulty of getting our product in, the local competition. And so we're actually going to rate them ahead of Brazil in terms of when we may go to market. Zach, you're nodding your head.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you what, like, this is an example I use all the time. When I talk to somebody and I say, where are you, what markets are you in? And they say, oh, we're in France, Italy, and Japan. I know they're going to fail because typically there simply isn't a product where those are the best markets. Those are markets they chose because they wanted to travel to France, France, Italy, and Japan, right? So when you talk to somebody and they say, oh yeah, I'm doing really well in Rwanda and Croatia, you know that they chose those markets for good reasons, right? So you used the word discipline a few times. It's all about discipline. We're not in this for fun, right? I was talking to a bunch of people who have been going to Dubai 3 or 4 times, and they say, oh yeah, we've had wonderful business. This guy took me out to dinner. This guy took me out to dinner. And I'm like, okay, do you have purchase orders? Because as far as I'm concerned, if you don't have a purchase order, you're a tourist, right? So if you're going to countries and you're having a lot of fun and you're eating great food and your wife's happy and all of this, and you're not getting purchase orders, you're not a businessman, you're a tourist. And that, so you should be choosing these markets with discipline based on where there's revenue, not because you think it's going to be fun to go there.
Okay, great point. And absolutely true. We are in this to be successful and to grow our business, not necessarily have a good place to go spend a nice weekend. Not a bad thing to do. A lot of great places out there and great places to visit. And certainly that becomes a key part of being successful in a market if you're committed to spending time in market, right? So in many cases, not exclusively, but in many cases, when a company takes the time to go through this process and feels confident that they have the right people in the right place focused on the right markets, then we have to start thinking about the right way to go to market. And as Zach said very early on, in many cases, particularly depending on the size of your organization, you're probably going to be working with some kind of a partner, an alliance partner, a independent third-party distributor, a sales agent of some kind. And of course, there's going to be a process to go through here to identify who those prospective partners are and then try to qualify them. We get into a large area here, again, where companies are very reactive. They want to get going quickly. They meet somebody at a trade show who has promised them the moon and they have said, this is the guy that I'm going to go to do business with, and haven't really taken the time to do the due diligence or walk them through a process to make sure that that partner in themselves know what they're getting involved with, right? So again, I think it's important here to take a 1/2 step back and make sure that you understand what it is a partner is going to do for you and how it is you are going to support your partner and make them effective. Zach?
Yeah, so here's what I do and what I recommend to my clients and what I've done for a long time is I map out the sales process, every step of it from the point of initially figuring out who the end users are, communicating with the end users, going through everything that needs to be done to make the sale, all the way to getting paid and getting delivery and installation, etc. Right? And then I figure out what part of that the headquarters of my manufacturing company is going to do, what part of that the regional sales manager is going to do, what part of that the partner is going to do, what part of that I might do as the head of international sales, right? Who does what in this sales process? And then I figure out what it really is I need from my partner, okay? And what do I mean by that? The partner is going to be doing the heavy sales lifting. If you come in and you say, I want the partner to be able to do installation, for instance, right? You might not be able to find somebody who knows how to sell and knows how to install, right? You can always find somebody who can install for an hourly fee, right? Twisting a screwdriver is a hell of a lot cheaper than knowing how to sell. So if you choose your distributor based on technical criteria, you're probably going to take a big bite out of your sales. what you want to do is you want to say, well, what does he need to know in order to sell? Well, he has to have relationships with these people, etc. Now, the other part of that is think about the elements of selling typically involve building rapport and delivering information correctly, right? But that's a very high level way of putting it, but typically that's the way it is. Now, if you can find the distributor that already has established rapport and has sold to the people you want to sell to, right, you are really, really moving that sales process forward. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to say, who are the end users I want to be selling to? And I'm going to make that very specific, right? If you like, I'll tell you what, I was talking to a client this morning, and he is selling to contractors who build multi-story buildings. He isn't selling to contractors who build single-story buildings or houses, right? What he's looking for are people who are dealing with multi-story buildings. That's going to be a finite number of contractors in any given country. And he wants partners who are already selling to those contractors. Right? I could give you 100 examples like this. What happens very often, one of the biggest mistakes people make is they say, well, I have a healthcare product. I'm going to go to a trade show and I'm going to stand around and hope that some random person shows up and will become my distributor. And as long as he's more or less in the healthcare business, he should be fine. Okay. And I can give you example after example of how that doesn't work. And one of the best examples is I worked with a company that sold a product that was being sold to the Ministry of Health to a specific individual within the Ministry of Health. Okay. It was every customer they had was had the same job title within the Ministry of Health. And they found a distributor who was specialized in selling to drugstores consumer over-the-counter medicines. Okay, there was zero overlap between the partner's skills and the needs of the principal. So of course there was zero overlap, there were zero sales. And then they were, surprised because they said, well, it's such a big, serious company. The owner has a lovely watch, a really expensive watch. And in their offices, they have espresso machines. They must be doing really well. I don't understand why this didn't work, right? Because they weren't thinking about what the partner really needed in order to sell to their target end user.
So Zach, let me just add on that, because I think, back to what I said before about process and discipline, right? Throwing in some additional real world examples here. I spent a number of years managing the Latin America business for Wilson Sporting Goods, based here in Chicago, traveling extensively to the entire region. Now, we went through several changes of distributors in various markets. You can imagine, particularly for many people, sports is a very attractive industry. People are always interested in turning their passion for tennis or golf or soccer into some kind of a business. And Wilson carries a lot of cachet, right? It's a very well-known global brand. So we didn't have any problem getting into a market and having any number of people say, I want to be the Wilson distributor for Peru, or I want to be the Wilson distributor for Colombia, right? And again, you have to really do yourself the favor of starting to figure out what exactly it is and how I'm going to qualify these people, right? Because you have to make some decisions here and you have to be able to select the right partner. And so, hang on, Zach. So just, I'll let you chime in here. So I'm throwing up here some examples of the kinds of things. We literally would put in a process where we would just make sure that in talking to any prospective partner, do they do the kinds of things that are going to help us be successful and that we know have worked for us in other markets, right? And then we would profile each of those distributors, and we would literally have the distributors basically put together for us some kind of a top level plan. And they needed to be able to address several of these questions, right? They needed to demonstrate beyond just I'm interested in being the Wilson distributor, that they in fact had the reach, the customer contacts, or they had the ability to put together a plan that showed that they were going to take all these variables into consideration, right? And it's important that as you're evaluating the distributors, right, there are some key things that you want to understand and want to know. I've kind of listed out several here, which I'll just throw out there because I know this will ring true with many people listening, and certainly Zach has experienced some of this. But you're going to want to ask some basic things. Does the distributor have the capability to achieve realistic market share? Do they have the financial strength to ramp up a product? Maybe today we're not as successful, not as well known. Can they dedicate resources in conjunction with the brand or supplier to grow the business? Do I need just one distributor per market? Or am I talking about different distributors in different segments or different geographies? Before I just hand over exclusivity to one person for all of Brazil, I may want to think that through very, very carefully, right? What about spending some time, obviously, working with them to understand, hey, do they know, as Zach has mentioned before, do they know how to sell? Do they know how to close business? Do they know how to get orders? Do they talk the same language that I talk? Some qualitative things, right? Is there a fit here with how this organization works and how I work? And I'm talking about going beyond just being able to communicate maybe in English or with my bilingual staff. Can we really see eye to eye on what some of the opportunities are here? And we have to do that, again, with a lens on not only what they can do, but can I support them, right? Because any partner relationship to be successful is a two-way street, right? If I can't demonstrate to the prospective partner that I'm going to be able to support the business, deliver on time, meet the requirements, support it with some co-branding activities and some investment on my own, whether it's at a high level or even locally with the distributor, right? So these are all things that, again, you need to take time looking through the list, asking some hard questions, and making sure that your processes and your strengths and weaknesses line up with those of the distributor, so that you don't do what Zach just talked about and kind of erroneously get in bed with somebody on day one who promises you the moon, and it turns out later that they're not the right fit for your organization. Because I can tell you, in a lot of markets, then making that change after the fact becomes incredibly complicated and difficult for a variety of reasons. Any thoughts on that, Zach?
Oh yeah. So first of all, I'll start with the where I was trying to jump in at the beginning. If you're, because very often you hear people that's like, oh, I'm so lucky I met somebody who's willing to be my distributor. If you're at a point where you have one candidate who randomly approached you, you have to completely rethink how you're doing things, okay? So I'll tell you something which a lot of people will disagree with. I never, ever, 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 ever work with some random guy who approached me at a trade show, okay? I decide who I want to work with and I approach them, and I'm typically dealing with 3 to 5 potential candidates in any given market. And then I'm going to figure out how, who's the best one. So if you're in a position where the best thing you can do to expand globally is get a booth at a trade show and stand around and hope that somebody is going to approach you, you really have to rethink that whole strategy, right? Because that's not going to work well in the long term for real results. Now, what I do and what I do and what Ernie do on this is pretty much the same thing. Just I use a little bit slightly different terminology. I'm looking for what I call bandwidth, which is how they can put resources on the ground. Focus, which is how they're going to put resources on my product. And competency. And the competency usually involves all the things I expect from them to be able to sell my product, be it the right relationships in place, the sales skills, if they do need to have some type of technical skills, that kind of thing. Now, here's the way I look at it. Focus will drive competency, because if they really want to sell my product, if they're interested in selling my product, they will build up their competency to match my expectations. So if you basically say to a company, look, you need to get a salesperson who understands software, for instance, right? Or you need to do a little bit more for me in terms of, product training. I need you to do 7 days worth of product sales training. If they're not interested, if you don't have focus, you're not going to get that improvement in competency. If you have focus, if they really want to sell your product, they're going to put the effort in to drive up competency. Bandwidth, typically you can't influence. Either the company is big or the company isn't big, but they're not going to take out a loan to grow because they want to work with you, right? So that's typically the way I look at it. And I'm going to measure. Now, what Ernie was talking about, I'll give you an example. It's a little bit different in terms of, maybe sporting goods or something consumer. But let's say you say, okay, there are 200 potential customers in the market, and I believe that it's going to require 4 meetings per client to close a deal. Then what that basically means is 800 meetings have to take place. Okay, 800 meetings in a market, that's about 4 full-time equivalents to do a good job covering that market. So you have to think, will they be able to put that kind of resources on this market to cover what I'm looking for? Can I get somebody who can do that? Is that what I need? So that's sort of the way I'm looking for bandwidth.
So Zach, I think you're touching on, again, a very critical point here, and that is that the time and effort to make the right decision on who you partner with in a market is critical. And there are really some very key things that need to be done, right? And you've kind of mentioned some of these already. Again, I'll just sort of list out some things that I have seen over the years that have been effective when applied rigorously, right? It's really important, of course, once you narrow down a list of partners who sort of meet the criteria, right? So we've kind of done this funnel. We've done our self-assessment. We've kind of figured out which markets make the most sense and are going to yield, we think, at a macro and micro level, the best success. And we're starting now to dig in and figure out who are the prospective partners that have the right makeup and the right approach and the right strategy that are going to fit with my business. And then we want to really drill down and get things on paper, and we want to get some serious commitments, and we need to spend some time in country working with them, even at the stage where we're trying to evaluate and select partners, right? So it's really important to visit the prospective partner on location prior to making any final decision or commitments. Don't just do it at the trade show in Germany and make a decision about Brazil, right? Here, let me just list a couple of things out, Zach, and hold that thought for a second, and then I'm sure you'll have some more comments on it. You want to make sure that you are, that you provide them with at least some kind of a template or performance plan. So you can get, I have always thought that it's really important not only to see how they are with customers and how they respond socially or on their feet, but I also like to get a sense of how they think critically and how they put pen to paper in the old-fashioned sense of, can they structure their business and the approach that's going to fit with the way I want to grow the business and we think is going to yield results. Never, ever hurts to get out on the road with some of their salespeople, right? Principals might be really good, very polished, good with customers. They are probably not going to be out there calling on the end users all the time. So if they've got a sales team, you want to spend some time on the ground with them, getting to know them and how they operate and how they work, right? Great idea is to try to do some research and make some calls on prospective customers with or without the prospective distributor, right? You can learn a lot from talking to customers directly about your brand, your distributor, your partner, and how they operate. So again, there's a whole laundry list of things here that I think that are questions that need to be asked, and tasks and things that should be done before you make a decision on a partner. And again, Zach, I'll throw it back to you if you've got any comment on any of those or any other things that I've missed.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there's a an old, I think, New Yorker cartoon or meme where there's a dog sitting in front, and a computer that says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And you got to keep in mind, you meet a distributor at a trade show, and there is no way to verify anything he tells you. And very often people will come up, and I see this all the time. Somebody will say, "Oh, I am so lucky. I just met the guy, and his brother-in-law is the king of Egypt," and blah blah blah. And you're like, I don't think you understand what's going on in that market at all, right? And you get that like constantly. People will lie to you at trade shows, and they'll tell you they're bigger than they are, and what Ernie said about seeing the offices, if you can. You want to see the offices. And I've seen some really horrific offices over the years where I just say, okay, if this is your office, I'm not planning on working with you, right? You want to take a look at it. Now, what I like to do, and again, this is a little bit more expensive, is I like to have a second person evaluate distributors. So what I do is I say, this is what I need from the distributor to make sure that they can sell my product. But I want somebody else to check them out from an operational perspective. And by that, I mean, do they have a good filing system in place, right? Do they have somebody who pays their bills? Do they have a good credit rating? That kind of stuff. And by having a second person, it also keeps me honest, because I might find somebody and say, oh, this is a great distributor, but they're just a mess in terms of the way they run their back office. And eventually that's going to bite me in the butt, right? So having a second person do that evaluation can be very helpful. But really, I'm not sure, people who are new to this, I'm not sure they understand how difficult it can be to get out of a distribution agreement with somebody. In a lot of these countries, the laws are really designed to protect the local citizens. So if you have a distribution agreement with somebody in Saudi Arabia or Brazil or many other countries, you are not going to get out of that without paying them off. Even if you think you have this fantastic, well-written agreement, doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to sell in that country without buying off the original distributor. So you have to make sure that you don't make a mistake doing this. Right. And again, I'm not trying to scare you out of doing business internationally, but what I am saying is, that guy who comes up to you at a trade show who tells you a great story, be very, very careful. Now, one thing you might also not get is that we used to have a term called a headhunter, and some people call these trophy guys or whatever. But the basic idea is a lot of these distributors want to have your logo on their wall, and they're going to leverage your logo. So let's say you talk about Wilson, right? Let's say there's a guy, and what he wants to do is he wants to get 10 other sporting goods companies. So if he can get Wilson as his principal, he's in a good position to get other people. Now, he might never sell a single ball of Wilson, but it's in his interest to get them. The other part of that is maybe he already represents a competitor of you. And if he can get exclusive distribution rights for your company, then he can keep you out of the market indefinitely. Okay, there are reasons they might
business, sure.
Right, there are reasons they might want to be your distributor that have nothing to do with selling your product. Okay, and if you fall into that trap, you are stuck.
So Zach, great comments, great points. And I think, again, I don't want to suggest that going through the process here that we're talking about, any of these pieces guarantee that you're not going to run into pitfalls or not have to make some adjustments or even find yourself down the road having to make some changes. I want to make a final point here just on working internationally. And if let's just take the high road and assume that we've gone through the process and we've been successful and we've identified the right markets and actually found some good partners that are fit and are going to work and meet the objectives that we have laid out. It is really important to maintain the contact and relationship and to constantly evaluate the not only their performance, but I think your performance in supporting them. So I'm just suggesting we've used a tool over the years where on a routine basis, we have suppliers not only evaluate themselves routinely on how they're doing. Are they living up to the expectations of the relationship? Are they meeting on their own objectives and what they committed to? And also is the partner meeting their expectations? And then having them cross evaluate each other. So I not only evaluate myself in terms of how I'm doing in the relationship, but I evaluate how you're doing. And I'm really interested in getting feedback from you on how you think you're doing in market, as well as how you think I'm doing. So the more that we can document this and the more that we can manage this process and hold people accountable and have clear expectations, the more likely we're going to be successful. So I'm trying, Bill, here to keep an eye on the time. I just want to kind of quickly, this is a very high level piece that we've talked about. And again, I'll make these slides available to whoever would like them. Really appreciate Zach's input on a lot of this stuff. So as a reminder, as you get ready to go do business internationally, be thinking about, start with some good self-evaluation on what your strengths and weaknesses are. Take the time to really dive in and understand what means or what constitutes a successful market for you. Identify the right go-to-market strategy and who you want to work with in a particular market, and then do yourself a favor, have not only a good implementation plan to get going and launched in the market, but make sure you're constantly assessing and evaluating your performance, your partner's performance, and quite frankly, the opportunity in the market. It might be a really great relationship for 10 years, and then markets might shift completely, and you may find that it's not the priority it was. You've got to be ready always to adapt and change as the market changes. So, Zach, great comments. Let me know if you got any other final thoughts. And
I'm just going to say
questions.
Yeah, I'm just going to say one more thing here. The distributor is not your customer. The distributor is part of your sales organization. And very often people say, well, I signed a distributor, I'm done, right? You signed a distributor, you have started work. Now you manage that distributor. And I could give you 20 examples of things where, very often I'm getting comments from people saying, but how can you tell him to do that, right? He's an independent businessman. You can't tell him to do that. I can. He's part of my sales organization, right? And I've had comments about, I had a distributor, one story is I had a distributor who was dating his saleswoman. And I told him I was going to terminate him over that if he did it again, right? And somebody said, well, how in his culture, in his country, it's legal. In his culture, it's acceptable. I said, I don't care. Salespeople are quitting because of something he's doing. It's going to impact my sales. He has to stop, right? I make sure people give me information and they put it into my CRM. I push people to work according, to use my marketing materials and not deviate from them, those type of things. You can't look at this like, okay, he's an independent businessman, he gets to do what he wants. It's your job now to manage this to get the best out of it. And that's the difference between doing an okay job and doing an excellent job in terms of growth.
Let me,
Zach and Bill, I tried to get my camera going, but it doesn't seem to be working. So I'll throw it back to you and try to answer any questions. I'm sure Zach can hang on for a few more minutes and would love to hear from anybody.
Yeah, let me throw out some questions / discussion points. And Ernie, let me like leverage or jump off, let's say the Wilson example, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, Wilson goes into Columbia. Wilson has a lot of choices, right? Let's shift to and assume there's a small business and they're viable. They're viable in the US. They have a value proposition. They can compete. They're getting a lot of interest. Let's call it a golf accessory or a tennis accessory even, right? I'm a little guy. I don't have that leverage or the visibility with the distributors that I would walking in the door with Wilson, right? So how do I get the attention and create some leverage with these A or B players in a particular market where I'm, again, the assumption is I'm a capable company with good export potential. I'm entering the market. How do I maximize my leverage?
So, whether it's Wilson or anybody else, and I know Zach probably has a comment here. So if you are, perhaps you don't have the luxury of the big W, you're not Nike or somebody that's, to use them as an example, that's very well known, right? So I'm working with some clients right now that have really good proprietary technology. They've been very, very successful. Their business is primarily focused online, or they're looking for brick and mortar. So, they are doing some of the things that would be sort of, I would consider routine, in the sense that they are figuring out in the market who the prospective customers are. They've tried contacting some customers directly to see if they can maybe start getting some business going that way initially. They've tried to spend some time in market, attending some trade shows, whether either exhibiting or even just going to the trade show to walk the floor and try to get an idea of who's down there, who the competitors are. Competitors also are often a good source of information on a particular market. What are they doing, good or bad or otherwise? And then, of course, sometimes you just have to pound the pavement, and you have to missionary sell your service and your expertise, whatever that may be, right? In this particular case, the client has something that it is more of a consumer product. It would not be considered a have to have. It's much more of a need to have, but they're focusing on technology, and they're focusing on the fact that they, in their case, are US made, which in certain markets lends some credibility. They're focusing on the fact that they've had some success online, which is helping them, because while their brand is not so well known, they can point readily to some of the success they've had, and they can use social media effectively to promote themselves, even in a country where they don't have a presence. So, again, some of this is really roll up the sleeves and just hit the ground and pound the pavement kind of stuff in some respects, right? But again, I would go back to try to do it with as much discipline and process as possible. Don't just run around offering up your product and your brand to the first person that you meet.
Yeah,
anything on that?
Yeah, so most of the stuff I've sold, I think pretty much everything I've sold hasn't necessarily had that had any type of weight or anybody know what it is or anything like that, right? But there are three things essentially that the distributor is looking for. The distributor is looking for, can I make money easily, and can I trust you? That's all they care about, right? So essentially what you want to do is your pitch should be, this is how much money is to be made in this market. And by that, I mean, look at the market and say, okay, if I'm selling in Colombia, I'm selling in Colombia a certain amount, then, I should be able to guess more or less what I should be able to sell, for instance, in Peru, right? You should be able to figure this out. You should be able to figure out indicators and say, there is a market. This is the reason I believe there's a market for my product in your country. This is how much money you can make. I'm going to make it easy for you. I have good marketing materials. This is what I'm going to do to support you. And we have a long-term plan to work with a single partner in your territory. We won't screw you over. And we understand that you might be concerned about this. This is how you can trust that we're not going to screw you over. I can basically tell you that I've onboarded about 1,000 distributors over the course of my life. If you answer those three questions correctly and do a good pitch, every time you reach out, you're going to get a very solid group of people coming back interested, no matter if they've heard of you, even if they haven't even heard of your product type, they have no idea what it is you're selling. You'll find distributors who want to work with you.
Okay, thanks for that insight. Here's a question for you, Zach, and then Ernie chime in. I found interesting, Zach, you talked about, coming into a distributor, seeing their bandwidth, right? let's go to a country, let's say a developing emerging market, where you've got a good player, they've got a lot of the capabilities you're looking for, but let's say there's not a lot of 20 or 30 or 40 years experienced people in that market, salespeople, right? Maybe maybe there was a opening of the market 10 years ago. So you walk in and you've got 15 salespeople that are 25 or 30 years old. They are order takers. They don't have any sales skills or sales training. How do you manage that? You've got your product training and your application training. Do you also take on sales training to this type of company, or how do you improve their actual nuts and bolts salesmanship?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I wouldn't approach it quite that way, but I do a lot of sales training for companies from a different perspective. Okay, but let me answer your exact question and then go on to that. So if I'm talking to distributors and they are order takers, I'm not going to, and I don't need an order taker, right? Because there are products that maybe that's what you need. You're doing all your marketing online, and what you need is somebody who can, handle that. Maybe that's what I'm looking for, but typically that's not what I'm looking for. I want people who can go out and sell. So what you typically will find, you will find distributors that maybe have the owner is a really good sales guy, right? Or the partner is a really good sales guy. And then they have 6 other people who aren't very good. So I'm going to look for that. I have yet to find a market where there weren't distributors that knew how to sell. You just have to look for them. Right. Now, that said, going to the second part of what you asked, I'm going to take that in a totally different direction. I do a lot of sales training. I did it as a VP, and I do it now as a consultant. What you do find is distributors don't train their young salespeople very well, because they figure those people are going to leave and they don't want to put the effort into training them. If you as a principal invest in training these salespeople, they will crawl through fire for you, right? You can build up their capabilities, you can build up their competencies, but not only that, you're going to drive focus. If you're doing a monthly mastermind to train salespeople, or you're sending out a newsletter where you summarize sales books, or you make yourself available to coach these young salespeople at a distributor's organization, they're going to love you. And if they're selling 6 products and they should be giving you 6 hours a week, they're not. They're going to be giving you 12 or 15 or 20 hours a week because they love you, and that's what you're aiming for. So I highly recommend doing sales training for the distributor sales organizations that work with you.
Hey, let me ask one more and then I'll open it up. Ernie, coming back to you, an example you had. Okay, let's talk brick and mortar distribution. How do you integrate or manage the channel conflict of an online channel as well? So,
yeah. I mean, it's an excellent question, and I think it becomes very complicated and necessary to manage, obviously, the pricing and the margins, right? So you've got to because the last thing you want to do is have an online channel sort of either completely step in and injure your channel partners and or even your retailers in some case, right? So typically, and again, this is not necessarily one approach for every market, but I know the companies and clients that I've worked with, we have been very, very careful we try to premium position our brands. In most cases, I have not worked for price sensitive companies, right? They tend to be premium brands, premium positioned. And when we launch online, we make sure that we're controlling that channel, that we are selling online through approved sites, and try as much as we can to manage resellers and things like that, so that we give our channel partners and our retail partners the opportunity to do what they do best, right? Which is service their customers and or deal with returns, or people that just prefer to go shop in those kinds of environments or buy that kind of way, right? It is a tricky environment. The last thing you want to do, again, is just put your product out there online and have it eat in or cut into your other channels, because then you're going to be left with primarily an online business and trouble with some of your other your other channels, right? So it's a delicate balance. Is probably the best way to answer that question. Try to price high as much as possible. Use your online presence as branding and sort of building value for your story and your company. And then make sure your channel partners, as Zach said, they will respond and support you, particularly if they feel like they can make money with your product, right? So you want to make sure, hey, and at the same time, if they do a good job doing that and you've priced correctly, well, then you've got that much more margin built into your online sales activity. So that's good. That's good also.
Zach, comment on the online channel?
You know what?
Conflict or
I'm-
integration?
I am really not an expert on that. I think I honestly would say I probably would not take a project or a job where I had online and direct and channel sales, because I'm not an expert on that, and it would kill me. So I'm just gonna leave what Ernie said up there.
Okay, let me open it up. Questions?
Hey, Brian, yeah, how's it going? So thank you so much for your time and all the insights. Really appreciate it. Very interesting. One thing that really bugs our clients or is a challenge is the decision of exclusive versus non-exclusive on a territorial basis backed by a performance guarantee or minimum sales to keep the exclusivity in place. Do you have thoughts on that? I mean, at this point, we take it industry by industry, and it's kind of company preference. But your thoughts, since you've seen such a diverse group of companies, would be really interesting.
So
hey,
sorry.
go ahead, Zach. No, please go ahead. Jim, I just
sorry.
wanted to ask before Zach answers. I'm sorry if I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Do you say currently your preference is to work with exclusive arrangements and put your distributors on some kind of a performance to keep the exclusivity? That's how you typically manage it?
That's sort of a first go-to position.
Okay.
But I can tell you we get pushback quite a bit when we suggest that.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, Zach. And then I do have some thoughts on that. It's go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I always tell people to work exclusive on territories. Now that might break up, you might work with 4 distributors in Germany, or, 4 in India, or whatever, but I don't want distributors competing with each other, because what I want is my distributor to be very much invested in promoting my brand. And if he thinks that he's not going to benefit from selling, he's not going to be invested in promoting my brand. It's going to be very easy for him to sell my product in such a way that he can switch out another product in the future. And you have to keep that in mind. Now, that said, what do I do? The other part of this is, and this will freak your clients out even more, I don't ask for minimum orders. I do performance based on not orders, but activity. So what I do with distributors is I say, it's our intention to work with you as an exclusive partner in this territory. In order to do that, what I'm looking for is these activities, and I break it down into the first 30, 60, 90, 180 days, the first year, the second year, in terms of activities. Only in the third year do I put a number on that. Now, the reason behind this is, let's say you work with a distributor and you come in and you say, okay, I'm going to give you the whole world. You have to give me $1 million purchase order in the next year. And he says, great, I'll do that. And then he comes back to you in 364 days. He says, you know what? I'm really sorry. I didn't think this works out. I'm resigning the line. You just lost a year, right? But if you basically say in the first month, here are the activities you have to do. This is what you have to do in the second month. This is what you have to do in the third month. Either he's doing those activities or he's not. If he does those activities and he doesn't sell, then you have a problem with your product and the expectation of your activities. If he isn't doing those activities, you fire him right away, right? So at this point, if you know what you're doing, you're going to get the sales you need out of that territory if you specify those activities correctly, okay? And this is the best way to get results, in my opinion.
So Jim, let me build a little bit on what Zach said, because this is a challenge, and I've seen multiple scenarios around this, right? Yeah, I think exclusivity makes some sense and would be a preference. Again, you want to make sure that you're not handing over exclusivity to someone that is limited in their ability to meet your objectives, right? So depending on the size of the market or the segment, maybe you have multiple distributors, maybe it's exclusivity by territory, some of the things that Zach pointed out. When it comes to performance minimums, I've used them typically in contracts with distributors. On the one hand, it does sort of get them to commit, it demonstrates some level of seriousness and commitment to the relationship. However, I personally tend to look at them as more contractual minimums, right? So I set them at a level that are like, look, if we can't hit these minimums, it's not worth it for either one of us. And they tend to agree. In this case, it's not really contentious. And let's hope that we're going to sell much more than that. If they meet the minimum, but don't do a lot of the other things that Zach is talking about, right? Well, we can have a different discussion about making some changes. Now, I'll throw a few other variables there that I'm sure you've probably seen, perhaps in your business or not. I've had situations, for example, in Mexico, particularly where I'm working with a distributor. It's an industrial product. There are many of the customers that have a presence in Mexico that are used to buying in the States. They want to buy direct, right? So they don't necessarily want to work through a distributor. So we might make some carve outs there or figure out some commission arrangements. In other cases, I've told distributors, look, I'm going to honor you. I'm going to give you exclusivity if you bring the business to me, right? And I'll honor that. But you got to make sure that you tell me who the end user is, because if not, I may inadvertently start negotiating a deal behind your back. I don't want to do that. If the client comes to me first, then okay, you won't necessarily be involved or get a piece of that business, but there might be some service or some add-on business or some follow-up business that, quite frankly, I'm happy to get you involved in the relationship, right? Because you want them working for you. So those are some gray areas that I see. But I would probably reiterate what Zach says. Going in, you want that commitment up front. So I think some exclusivity makes some sense. It gives them some comfort. But you got to be on top of them. You got to manage it, of course, and you want to make sure, as he said, don't burn a year and find out later that they have no chance of making their minimum or their target, right?
And then also pricing. So if in general, I guess my experience has been just setting standard pricing, but then some pushback is, well, no, this market, the ability of the consumer to buy is much lower. Let's give the distributor a break. Not related to volume. I totally get volume-based pricing, but I'm saying literally that you've got country A buying at a deeper discount than country B. My concern, of course, being gray marketing. But thoughts on actually not having consistent international pricing?
Zach, go ahead.
So my first question would be, do you really want to be in that market? Right? If they can't afford to buy your product, do you really want to be in that market? Because if somebody's buying, if somebody in Peru is buying your product less than they're buying it in Colombia, you can bet that product is going to cross the border at one point or another in the future, right? So now you could say, okay, for the first year, I'm getting into this market, I'm going to cut prices to buy some market share. I'm going to do some promotions, that kind of thing. But I like to have consistent pricing. Now, one thing you can do about that is you can come up with a couple of different product lines. You can have, your A product and your B product and your C product that are slightly different priced. But selling the same product in different markets at different price points is usually a recipe for having a problem if you do it in the long term, right? You can do it, you can play around with it, you can get by with it for a couple of years, but in the long term, it's probably going to cause you some grief.
Yeah, and Jim, I would just add on there again, the exceptions to the rule, right? So I've worked with various companies, more consumer companies that will work on very strict sort of MSRP type of end user prices, at retail, and making some adjustments because of landed costs. So they're all relatively speaking, and then kind of tell their distributors, you need to figure out how to buy and resell or manage the margins locally to meet that so that it's not out of whack and I don't have a lot of gray marketing. I also have another client, for example, that they're an industrial seller and they operate on a very strict net price policy. So they sell their piece of equipment at $20,000 and they tell their distributors, you buy it at 20 grand and you can mark it up whatever you think the market will bear in your country, but you buy it at the same, everybody buys it at the same price. And, they let the distributor, some guys are more aggressive than others, can live on 5 or 10 or 30%. And he lets them do that. And he kind of stays out of the fray, if you will.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any more questions? If not, I have one more and we could go. Anybody? Here's my last question, gents. So let's go back the last 10, 15 years, right? We've lived through the growth of China, the growth and the glory years of the US and Chinese commercial experience and growth, right? What are you guys seeing now in the Chinese market? There's change in politics. There's a nationalism in China. Maybe the American brands don't travel as well as they used to. Do you see the potential or the size or the upside in the market as much as it would have been, let's say, 10 years ago? Comments?
Go ahead, Zach.
Ernie, you want to take that? Well, I was going to take that in a different direction, but I'll tell you what, when I started out, everybody I knew wanted to sell to Japan. And I had all these friends who, studied Japanese and all of that. And Japan was hot, and then Japan wasn't hot. And now China's hot, and now China isn't hot. I say follow the money, right? Figure out who can pay for your product and go there. For me, I'll sell to China, but I'm much more interested right now in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because I think that's where a really good investment in terms of return on your money is, figuring out how to sell to sub-Saharan Africa. And again, in 10, 15 years, maybe that's not going to be the hot market. But I would say it's a mistake to say, oh, I really want to be selling to China, right? You want to be selling to the people who have money to buy your product.
Yeah, and Bill, wow. I mean, that's I know we're up against the time here, and that in and of itself is a long, involved discussion, right? I kind of piggybacking again on what Zach said. I mean, I remember when Japan was not only the up and coming place to be, but it was a foregone conclusion that they were just going to take over and buy all of New York, right? They were going to own it. So I'm very much a realist when it comes to China. I think they are depending on your industry and your market. It is not just one Coke for every Chinese type of a Chinaman type of approach. You have to be very realistic about who you're doing business with. And then I won't even get into all of the things that most people are aware of, right? The trademark issues, the pirating, the knockoffs. So China to me is an opportunity, as Zach said. Work with people you can trust. Do your homework. Get paid for your product. Don't put all your eggs in one basket is kind of the way I look at it.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'll pass it over to Gene, and I think we're ready to wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks for moderating, Bill, and thanks for all of your input, Zach. Really big help and very much appreciated.
No, always a pleasure.
Well done, gents.